The story of how that stake was found begins in 1982 in Titusville, Florida, 6 miles from where space shuttles launch. A construction crew was clearing land for a housing development when a backhoe operator hit a human skull. He called the police. The police called a forensic expert. The forensic expert called Dr. Glen Doran of Florida State University. And Doran, standing at the edge of what appeared to be a shallow pond, had no idea that what he was about to find would change North American archaeology forever. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. Between 1984 and 1986, Doran's team drained the pond and began excavating. What they found beneath 6 feet of water, beneath 1.5 meters of undisturbed peat, were 168 human beings, all placed in the fetal position, all lying on their left sides, all with their heads oriented west, each one wrapped in woven fabric, hand-twisted palm fiber, constructed in 7 different weave patterns across 86 fragments found in 37 separate graves. Each body was staked to the pond floor so it would not float away. Think about that for a second. Someone thought carefully about buoyancy. Someone thought about how a wrapped body behaves underwater, and then they built a system to hold the people they loved in place. Burial 25 was a child, approximately 3 years old. She had a deer antler tool beside her right hand, one that showed wear marks, meaning she had been using it before she died. She was wrapped in fabric, staked to the bottom, and left facing the setting sun. Her brain survived intact for 7,800 years. 91 of the 168 skulls still contained soft tissue, not impressions, or not casts, actual brain material with cell structures visible under an electron microscope. Dr. William Hauswirth at the University of Florida College of Medicine had never seen anything like it. Nobody had. He became the first scientist in history to extract and analyze human DNA from 8,000-year-old neural tissue. And when the results came back, they were unlike anything in the record. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest Windover burials at approximately 6,000 BCE. That is 2,000 years before Stonehenge, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid, and the DNA evidence showed that the same family groups had been returning to the same pond for over a century. One family, one pond, across multiple generations. This was not an accident. This was not a campsite. This was a civilization that chose a specific place in Florida to keep its dead. And when Hauswirth finally sequenced the DNA inside those brains, what came back didn't match any living Native American population ever studied. Not approximately, not partially, completely. If you've ever wondered where we really come from, and I mean really in a way that goes deeper than any family story you've been told, then subscribe. Because what's inside those 91 preserved brains is only the beginning. Completely. That word was sitting in the air when Hauswirth published his results in 1990. He had spent years at the University of Florida College of Medicine developing a method to pull DNA from 8,000-year-old neural cells. To do that with tissue this old from a tropical preservation environment had been considered technically impossible. Most scientists in his field told him it couldn't be done. He did it anyway. And when the sequences resolved on the screen, the data confirmed what many expected, and then delivered something nobody had a clean explanation for. The expected part looked like this. The Windover people carried mitochondrial haplogroups B, C, and D. Those are well-documented markers. They appear in ancient populations that crossed the Bering Land Bridge, the connection between what is now Siberia and Alaska. In a migration most genetic models placed between 25,000 and 16,000 years ago. Haplogroups B, C, and D say Asian origin, Beringian entry, the standard model. That was clean, that was confirmable, that was fine. Then Hauswirth found 2 mitochondrial variants he had never seen before. But he contacted a geneticist at the University of Michigan named Andrew Merriweather, who had completed one of the most extensive surveys of ancient and modern Native American DNA ever assembled. Hauswirth sent him the sequences and asked him to look. Merriweather had seen them too, and yet the data was pointing in a direction that contradicted what the migration model predicted. The sequences carried the signature motifs of something called haplogroup X. And haplogroup X is not a simple marker. It does not sit cleanly inside any single population or any single migration route. Today, haplogroup X appears in roughly 25,000 members of the Ojibwe Nation of the Great Lakes. It appears in Sioux communities. It shows up in the Druze populations of Lebanon and northern Israel, in the Basque country of northern Spain, in certain populations across Central Asia. It straddles the Atlantic in ways that haplogroups B, C, and D do not. It does not belong to one origin. It belongs somehow to all of them at once, or none of them clearly. And it was sitting in 8,000-year-old brains at the bottom of a Florida pond. Dr. Peter Parham, a Stanford University immunogeneticist who analyzed the Windover MHC gene sequences alongside Hauswirth's team, noted in the published findings that certain sequences recovered from the Windover population appeared more distantly related to known Amerindian patterns, and might, in his words, reflect genetically distinct origins. A scientist of Parham's standing does not write that phrase lightly. Genetically distinct origins is the scientific equivalent of standing at a map and saying, I do not know where these people came from. And that is not a comfortable sentence in a field built on models. Everything I just told you about where the Windover people came from, hold on to it. It's about to mean something different. When the 1994 follow-up analysis was published, researchers flagged the haplogroup X identification as potentially contaminated. The extraction methodology used in 1986 predated the contamination controls that are now standard practice. The result was not retracted. It was disputed. And that distinction is the most important thing I've said so far, because a retracted result disappears. A disputed result stays. It sits in the literature like a live wire that every researcher who approaches the Windover data must either grab or carefully step around. Right now, today, haplogroup X is present in living Native American communities, and the oral traditions of the Ojibwe describe a people who came before them, a lineage they do not name, but associate with specific knowledge, knowledge of water, knowledge of weaving, knowledge of how to bury the dead in ways that hold them in place. The genetics calls this population a gap in the record. The Ojibwe call them the first ones. Both descriptions are pointing at exactly the same absence. Actually, real quick, before we go any further, I want to know something about you. Drop in the comments. Where does your family trace back to? Even just a country or a region is enough. Because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why where you're sitting right now might be more connected to this pond in Florida than you'd ever expect. I read every comment, no name. That is the formal scientific designation for what the Windover people represent in the genomic record of the Americas. Researchers call them a ghost population, not because of anything mystical, but because their genetic signature appears in the record, runs for 1,300 years of continuous burial at this one pond, and then stops. The last confirmed Windover burial dates to approximately 5,000 BCE. After that date, the pond was never used again, and the specific genetic markers that define the Windover population don't appear in any southeastern sample ever studied after that point. But here's where it gets strange, because the disappearance isn't what we assumed it was. Dr. Glen Doran spent 4 decades at Florida State University working through the Windover assemblage. The DNA analysis of the remains confirmed something unusual. Across 1,300 years of burials, the same family groups kept coming back. The same blood connections, the same lineage markers, generation after generation returning to the same pond. That's not a nomadic group passing through. That's a community with a fixed address for its dead. And the DNA evidence showed they weren't just genetically related across time. They were medically caring for each other too. The skeletal evidence tells that story clearly. Multiple individuals in the Windover assemblage survived serious injuries that without sustained care would have been fatal. Unhealed rib fractures, a healed cranial depression, the kind of head injury that would have caused permanent neurological damage, severe arthritis. One boy lived to 16 years old with spina bifida, a condition that would have left him unable to walk or care for himself. Someone carried him. Every day for 16 years, someone carried him. And when he died, they wrapped him and drove a stake through his burial cloth and left him in the water with everyone else. Burial 58 is an adult male, approximately 40 years old. Extraordinary longevity for this period. 3 healed rib fractures, a healed head wound, degenerative joint disease throughout his lower body. He was buried with 3 layers of fabric wrapping, more than anyone else at the site. more than the children, more than the women, more than the able-bodied adults. 3 layers, because someone thought he deserved that. Communities that carry their injured for 16 years and wrap their dead in triple layers of hand-woven fabric do not quietly dissolve. They end for a reason. There are 2 explanations for why the Windover genetic signature vanishes after 5000 BCE. The first is that these people died, every single one of them, every descendant, without leaving a single traceable genetic echo in any population ever sampled from North America. The second is that their descendants are alive right now, in communities whose connection to Windover has simply never been tested, because the samples that would prove it have not been collected. One of those possibilities is a tragedy. The other is something else entirely. Across the academic literature on early archaic North America, there are scattered signals, small partial genomic echoes in southeastern samples from after 5000 BCE that share structural features with Windover-era haplogroup patterns. No published study has formally traced this connection, not because the data isn't there, because the question itself, whether any living community carries Windover ancestry, sits at the intersection of science, law, and tribal sovereignty in ways that have made every researcher who noticed it put the notepad down. January 12, 2024, Washington, D.C. The U.S. Department of the Interior published the final revisions to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the law known as NAGPRA, the legislation that has governed access to ancient human remains in American institutions since 1990. The 2024 revisions were significant. They closed a loophole that had allowed museums to hold on to remains indefinitely. They shifted the burden of proof to institutions. For most ancient American sites, this was a step forward. For the Windover case, the picture was more complicated than anyone in that press release acknowledged. NAGPRA requires consultation with federally recognized tribes before any destructive testing of ancient remains. That's a reasonable requirement. It exists because for over a century, American institutions collected Native American bones without consent, without return, without so much as a conversation with the communities those bones came from. The law was a reckoning that was long overdue. But the Windover people are a category NAGPRA was not designed to handle. Their 1994 DNA analysis confirmed something that has never been resolved. Their mitochondrial lineages were, in the paper's own words, absent in all other prehistoric and contemporary Native American populations studied to date. There is no tribe to consult. There is no demonstrated cultural affiliation to any living group. And the process for consultation has no procedure for a situation where the very connection the law assumes already exists is the thing you are trying to scientifically establish. Shannon O'Loughlin of the Association of American Indian Affairs put it plainly in recent commentary on the 2024 revisions. The Windover case represents exactly the situation the law still doesn't know what to do with. Remains whose cultural affiliation cannot be determined because the genetic testing that would establish it has never been done. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what that institutional silence implies. The samples are not lost. The brains are not degraded. 91 human skulls, sitting in temperature-controlled storage in optimal peat preservation conditions, contain DNA that modern ancient genome sequencing could almost certainly read. The methods exist. The technology exists. The will to use it does not. Actually, if you watched my last video on the ancient DNA of the first Americans, you already saw the first edge of this problem. That video was asking who the original migrants into the Americas actually were. What did it change about how you think about Native American ancestry? Tell me in the comments, then stay with me, because what comes in the next few minutes is the part that video was building toward. Since the original Hauswirth extraction in 1990, ancient DNA science has experienced 3 revolutions that the Windover samples have missed entirely. In 2010, Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sequenced the Neanderthal genome, proving that ancient DNA from degraded tissue could yield full genomic data. In 2015, the Harvard Ancient DNA Lab under David Reich sequenced 92 ancient Americans from across 12,000 years of history and rewrote the timeline for how the Americas were settled. In 2022, researchers sequenced early American genomes from samples more degraded in harsher preservation environments than anything at Windover. The Windover brains, 91 of them in ideal conditions, have not been retested with any of those tools. The original 1994 analysis flagged the haplogroup X result as potentially contaminated. What no published paper has squarely addressed is this. The critique of that contamination used the same methodology it was criticizing. It checked the compromised tools with the compromised tools. A review paper identified this problem. That review has fewer than a dozen citations in the entire published literature. It is the most important paper almost nobody read. Fewer than a dozen citations. For a paper that identified a potential flaw in the foundational DNA data of the most scientifically significant early archaic site in North American history. That number is not obscurity, that is a choice. And the reason for that choice has three separate sources, none of them coordinated, all of them documented, all of them pointing in the same direction. The haplogroup X signal in the Windover data has been weaponized so many times by so many different groups that the legitimate scientific question has been made radioactive. Any researcher who publishes a finding connecting haplogroup X to an unusual ancient American origin story knows what happens next. Within months, sometimes weeks, their work gets cited by people they have never met and do not want to be associated with. This isn't just ancient history. And this is happening to living scientists trying to do real work right now. The first group to exploit the Windover data was the Solutrean hypothesis crowd. The Solutrean hypothesis argues that Ice Age Europeans, from what is now France and Spain, crossed the Atlantic on sea ice roughly 20,000 years ago and founded the earliest North American cultures. This theory is not accepted by mainstream genetics or archaeology. The genomic evidence contradicts it at every turn. But it has a persistent and loud following, and the haplogroup X ambiguity in Windover was treated by its proponents as confirmation, even though no geneticist in the original study said any such thing. The second group were certain religious communities who had long argued for pre-Columbian migration from the Old World to the Americas as a matter of theological belief. Any ambiguity in the Native American origin story, any hint of a non-Beringian signal, got absorbed into that argument immediately. The third group used it differently, and more insidiously. Any uncertainty in the ancestry of Native American populations has been used in certain political contexts to complicate the narrative of indigenous presence, and therefore indigenous land and sovereignty claims. If the original Americans might not have been who we think, then the story of who has the deepest roots here becomes negotiable. That framing is not science, it is a political tool. But it requires only a disputed haplogroup result to find its legs. Dr. Deborah Bolnick, a geneticist who has spent years documenting the misuse of ancient American DNA data, published direct responses to this pattern, noting that documentary filmmakers had edited interview footage of credentialed scientists to make them appear to endorse theories those same scientists had publicly rejected. The scientists saw their words reversed. The documentaries were not pulled. None of these groups are scientifically credible. But together, they have created a situation where asking the legitimate question, what does the haplogroup X signal in Windover actually mean, requires navigating a minefield that most researchers simply decide is not worth crossing. So the question goes unasked. The brains stay in their trays. The data ages. And this is where it gets strange, because the scientific freeze at Windover did not stop the story from moving. It just moved somewhere nobody was watching. And let's set all of that aside for a moment. The politics, the fringe theories, the weaponized citations, the legal gridlock. Strip all of it away. Look only at what the actual evidence says. The convergent, cross-disciplinary evidence from genetics, physical anthropology, textile analysis, and archaeological context. Because when you line it up cleanly, the answer about where the Windover people came from is not actually in doubt. And the answer, on its own, is remarkable. The haplogroups B, C, and D confirmed in the Windover remains are well-established markers of the original peopling of the Americas. They track through Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, in a migration most genomic models placed between 25,000 and 16,000 years ago. The Windover people came from Asia. They walked across what is now the Bering Strait. They moved south. They arrived in the southeast thousands of years before Windover Pond was ever used as a cemetery. This is not disputed. this is not speculative. The Windover people are, genetically, among the oldest confirmed Native American populations ever studied. Full stop. The textiles make this even clearer. The fabric analysis by textile specialist James Adovasio identified construction techniques across the 86 Windover fragments that imply a weaving tradition already centuries old at the time of the earliest burial. You don't develop 7 distinct weave patterns overnight. You don't teach that to children from nothing. Those patterns were inherited from people who inherited them from people before that. The Windover community had been in the Southeast long enough to develop, was refined, and passed down a sophisticated textile culture across generations. These were not migrants pausing in Florida on their way somewhere else. They were established. They were home. Burial 11 makes this concrete. A woman, approximately 25 years old, buried with a piece of fabric featuring an interlocking diagonal twill weave, a construction technique that would not reappear in the North American archaeological record for roughly 3,000 years after her death. The fabric has been independently carbon dated. The weave has been independently identified. The 3,000-year gap is real. She knew something her successors had to rediscover from scratch. So here is the clean answer. The Windover people were Native American by every definition that term carries. They came from Asia. They entered through Beringia. They had been in Florida long enough to build a civilization with a cemetery, a textile tradition, and a community that cared for its most vulnerable members across decades. Mystery solved. Story over. Except, everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. A 2015 analysis of early archaic populations from Georgia and South Carolina found something that had been sitting in the data, unaddressed, for years. The Windover genetic profile does not simply vanish after 5000 BCE. It compresses into a single population cluster that began moving north along the Atlantic coastline during a period of rapid sea level rise that, between 6000 and 4000 BCE, submerged approximately 40% of Florida's landmass. The Windover people were not wiped out by a catastrophe. No, they were pushed out by the Atlantic Ocean itself. And the population they compressed into, the one that absorbed them, carries a different name entirely. The population cluster that absorbed the displaced Windover-era genetics moving north along the Atlantic coast has been identified in multiple early archaic studies as ancestral to what archaeologists label the Southeastern Archaic tradition. That tradition is the genetic foundation of what would later become some of the largest and most enduring indigenous nations in North American history: the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Cherokee, and dozens of related peoples across the Southeast. The Windover people did not vanish. Their genetics diluted across a continental community, the signal becoming fainter with each passing century, until it fell below the threshold of detection in the methodologies available to 1986 science. The 2015 Harvard Ancient DNA study, led by David Reich, which sequenced 92 ancient individuals across 12,000 years of American prehistory, identified a deep ancestral stratum in southeastern populations that shares ancestry with early Florida populations. The study did not specifically name Windover. It did not have access to new Windover samples. But the ancestral stratum it identified sits in exactly the genetic position that an expanded, dispersed Windover population would occupy if it had been absorbed into the Southeastern Archaic tradition between 4000 and 2000 BCE. The dots are there. The line between them has not been drawn because no one has had access to fresh Windover data to draw it with. See, but here's what makes this more than a genetic footnote. The Seminole people, the only Native American nation in the continental United States that never signed a peace treaty with the federal government, have occupied the Florida Peninsula in some form continuously. Their deep ancestral genetics, under modern whole genome analysis, would almost certainly contain some signal of Windover-era ancestry, not as a majority. As a thread, a specific old thread that runs from wooden tripod stakes at the bottom of a Titusville pond directly into living people. And in Seminole oral tradition, the creation of fabric, the specific act of weaving, is connected to ancestors who came before the named ancestors. Not a culture hero, not a mythological figure. The people who were here first. The tradition does not give them a name. It describes what they left behind, the knowledge of how to make things that last in water. Think about that for a second. The Seminole tribe of Florida has not been formally approached about genetic collaboration on the Windover remains. The legal pathway under NAGPRA for establishing cultural affiliation without direct lineal genetic proof exists, but it requires tribal initiative. The researcher cannot make the first move, and the tribe has no reason to make that move if no one has told them what the data already suggests might be there. In 2019, a genomic study of southeastern Native American populations identified a specific mitochondrial signature in Seminole and Muskogee DNA that does not appear in any other North American population group, and that shares structural similarity with the haplogroup patterns first identified in the 1986 Windover study. The study was not looking for Windover. It was not about Windover. The similarity was flagged in a single paragraph on page 14 of a 40-page supplementary appendix. Nobody followed up. Here is the argument against everything I've just told you, and it deserves to be said properly, not dismissed, not minimized, because it is made by serious scientists who have seen what happens when genetic speculation gets attached to living communities. The Windover DNA data is old. It was extracted in 1986 with methods that predated modern contamination controls. The haplogroup X identification has been flagged as potentially spurious. The 2019 Southeastern Population Study was not designed to look for Windover connections and did not claim to have found one. And the broader argument that the Windover genetics compressed northward and survived inside southeastern nations is a connection that no peer-reviewed study has formally established with new data. Connecting living people to uncertain ancient genomic results has caused real harm in real legal and social contexts. The caution is not cowardice. It is the result of watching, over decades, what happens when half-confirmed science gets converted into identity claims. That argument is not wrong. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what leave it alone requires us to accept. In 2022, research teams using modern ancient DNA sequencing tools recovered full genomic data from samples far more degraded than anything in the Windover assemblage, including specimens from harsh, non-ideal preservation conditions that produce far worse DNA survival than Florida peat. The contamination problem is not a permanent barrier. It is a solvable technical challenge that the field solved years ago for sites with half the preservation quality of Windover. And in 2023, researchers successfully extracted and sequenced whole genome data from a 10,600-year-old human tooth found in an Alaskan cave. That sample, older than Windover, from a colder and less stable preservation environment, is now generating published papers. The Windover brains, watched in their temperature-controlled trays in the best ancient DNA preservation conditions in North America, remain untouched. That comparison does not need a commentary. It needs a moment of silence. What is left, once the Steelman argument has been heard and answered, is not a conspiracy. It is not suppression. It is something more ordinary, and in some ways more troubling. Institutional inertia, maintained by simultaneous political discomfort from multiple directions at once. Scientists, tribal nations, legal scholars, and fringe theorists, all pulling in different directions, all with legitimate, or at least understandable reasons, producing collective paralysis. The most genomically significant ancient site in North American history has been effectively frozen since Ronald Reagan was in office. The question is not what the Windover DNA would show if it were tested. The question is what our collective decision not to test it says about us. That question belongs to right now, not to 8,000 years ago. There is still a pond in Titusville, Florida, a quarter acre, 6 feet of water over 1.5 meters of undisturbed peat. Below the peat, in the cold dark, there are still wooden tripod stakes in the ground, because Doran's team did not excavate the entire site. They made a deliberate choice to leave part of it sealed, to save it for future generations with better tools. That was the right call in 1986. That was the right call in 2000. The future they were saving it for arrived years ago, and we are doing nothing with it. In 2023, the Brevard County Historical Commission visited the site, took water samples, and assessed the peat integrity. Their conclusion, the preservation conditions at Windover Pond remain exceptional. The brains that were never excavated are still there, still intact, still waiting. The report recommended further study. It was filed. It has not been acted upon. If you want to understand what DNA can actually do, not as a genealogy kit, not as a parlor trick, but as the only language the dead have left for speaking directly to the living, then subscribe to this channel, because the story of who the Windover people were is not finished. The next chapter is sitting in a government archive, and it's waiting for someone to demand it be opened. The Windover people buried their dead within 48 hours of death. They came back to this pond for over a century. They wrapped their injured in fabric and drove stakes through their burial cloths so they would not float away. They oriented every body toward the setting sun. They were meticulous about memory. They built a system, a physical, engineered, maintained system, for not forgetting the people they had lost. Every ancient DNA lab in the world has, since 2010, been doing the same thing, building systems to remember people that time tried to erase, rereading genomes from dust, pulling identity from fragments, giving names back to the nameless. There is a moment that every geneticist who works in ancient DNA describes the same way, the moment when a sequence resolves on the screen and a person who has been gone for thousands of years suddenly has a location, a direction, a lineage. For most ancient Americans, that moment has arrived. For the Windover people, 168 of them plus however many more are still in the peat below a Florida pond, the sequence is still running. The cursor blinks. The data is there. We have simply chosen not to look at it. And the question that leaves behind, the one without a clean answer, without a legal pathway, without a resolution any institution has been willing to claim, is not really about them. It is about what kind of people look away from the ones who built a system so they would never be forgotten.